On a cold February afternoon on the West Mesa of Albuquerque, a woman walking her dog paused at the edge of a hard, windswept patch of desert. The dog had gone still, nose down, tail rigid. The kind of sudden animal quiet that means something is wrong. A few feet ahead, where the wind had shaved the sand thin, bone was showing through. Not a deer, not a coyote. Human. At first, it seemed like a terrible one-off discovery. But the earth there was a graveyard waiting to be spoken aloud. Within days, investigators would find not one body but many. One bone led to another. One shallow grave led to a second, a third, a fourth. The West Mesa gave up its secrets in fragments. A femur, a jaw, a necklace tangled in scrub, a strip of fabric that had somehow outlasted both weather and time. When the count paused, the number would stand like a curse: 11 women and one unborn child. The press called it a mass grave. Detectives called it an active crime scene. The city called it a nightmare finally unearthed. The first hours were a sprint. They taped off the area, called in crime scene techs, flagged and photographed every scrap of evidence. Teeth for dental records, buttons and earrings for possible identification. The wind was the enemy, erasing footprints and shifting the ground like a living thing. Even the light was against them, harsh and flat, squashing depth and shadow until everything looked the same. But the pattern didn't lie. The graves were clustered. The method suggested repetition. The care taken to return to the same place again and again implied familiarity. Someone who knew the mesa when it was still empty enough to hide a human being under a few inches of sand and vanish without a trace. The victims' names became a litany. Women who had been missing, some for months, some for years. Most of them were involved in sex work or struggled with addiction. Lives lived on the margins of a city that did not always see them. The investigative team split into lanes. One group processed the site, moving slowly, methodically, piece by piece. Another pulled old missing person files, cross-referencing descriptions with whatever bones and artifacts had been pulled from the ground. A third began the city-wide dragnet. Interviews with families, friends, outreach workers, motel clerks, and officers from Vice who knew the streets and the names better than anyone. The first real theory was also the simplest. A serial killer had been hunting in Albuquerque, targeting women who were less likely to be reported missing quickly, and even less likely to have their cases pursued with urgency. The suspect would have needed transportation, privacy, a reason to be on the mesa, again and again, and enough confidence to believe the desert would keep its mouth shut. When you stand out there at dusk, the city skyline looks like a map of light in the distance, close enough to see, but far enough to be no help at all. The wind brushes the grass in long strokes. The dirt road that once cut so close to the burial site is still traceable on old satellite images, a track that runs like a quiet promise from a cluster of trailers to the empty land where the graves would appear. In 2006, that road ran straight from a particular trailer to the site. At least, that's what old eyes on the case say. And that is where one name first floated to the top: Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya had a history: assaults on sex workers, threats uttered with the easy cruelty of a man who believed women like them could vanish without consequence. Co-workers told stories they wish now they'd taken to the police sooner. Offhand comments about killing women, about burial, about the West Mesa. And then there was December 2006, a night that still feels like the hinge of a terrible door. Montoya strangled a teenage sex worker in his trailer. When her boyfriend came looking, an argument exploded into gunfire. Montoya fell, shot, and dead. After that, something eerie happened. The West Mesa killings stopped. Causation isn't proof. Correlation isn't a confession. Detectives repeated those truths like a mantra. Still, the edges fit too cleanly to ignore. Montoya lived less than 3 miles from the mesa. The track that once linked his trailer to that patch of dirt could be followed on aerial images. His known behavior rhymed. Same victim profile, same violence, and the timeline mattered. If he was the one, the person who hunted, killed, transported, and buried, then the sudden halt after his death would make sense. A predator removed by sheer chance and a bullet. But the case never settled into certainty. There was no forensic thread tying his hands to those graves. No DNA. No smoking gun that persisted in the hard sun. When easy answers fail, the case grows tentacles. Other names emerge, men with proximity and pasts that set detectives' teeth on edge. One of those was a photographer and businessman, Ron Irwin, who traveled to Albuquerque's state fair regularly. In August 2010, his property in Missouri was searched. The police carried out tens of thousands of photographs. The scale made people swallow hard. But in the end, nothing in those pictures tied him to the mesa, and nothing about his life did either. He was cleared. Another name rose, one already stained by crimes no city wants under its skin. Joseph Blee. In the 1980s, Blee broke into the homes of girls barely into their teenage years and raped them. The press called him the middle school rapist. The moniker stuck because it was accurate and horrifying. Decades later, in 2014, attention shifted his way in the West Mesa investigation. There were coincidences, evidence suggestive, if not definitive. A tree tag in the burial area linked to a nursery Blee frequented. Women's undergarments and jewelry in his possession that did not belong to his wife or daughter. His DNA on the belt of a sex worker murdered in 2015. In jail on a separate conviction, a cellmate would claim Blee had confessed to hiring some of the women who later turned up in the desert. Blee denied any involvement. The case record filled with the push and pull of half-answers. Was he a predator who operated in his own orbit? Or part of the same black hole of violence that left bones under the sand? The net widened to include other figures of interest. A pimp named Fred Reynolds, who knew at least one of the missing women and was rumored to keep photos of several who would later be found in the Mesa graves. He died in January 2009, before the graves were discovered, and his death cut that thread short. A convicted serial killer, Scott Lee Kimball, was considered and interviewed. He said he had no connection, and nothing solid tied him to Albuquerque during the critical years. Between suspects and theories, the work of identification continued. Families came forward with hope and dread in equal measure. Mothers clutched photographs. Sisters handed over dental records and the last messages they'd received. Some of the women were known to the streets, to outreach workers who still spoke about them in the present tense, as if to unsay the reality lying under detective tents on the mesa. Each identification was its own earthquake, rippling outward through families, through the city, through the detectives who had learned to balance compassion with the steel they needed to see this through. The West Mesa itself complicated the science. The desert preserves and destroys with equal indifference. Soft tissue gone, hair sometimes clinging, jewelry surviving like a thumbnail signature. Time had sanded down edges that might have told a clearer story. The burial method suggested the killer, or killers, returned to the same area repeatedly, driving up in the dark, unloading, digging shallow pits, and leaving before dawn brushed the range. There were no house lights to see you out there, no neighbors to peek through blinds, just the sound of the wind and the low rumble of a distant freeway. A night that welcomed secrets. In 2010, the city put up a $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. Tips came in. Most were dead ends, some were fantasies, a few were slivers of something that never grew into a whole. The timing of the bodies complicated everything. Some had been in the ground for years. A pattern was visible but blurred by weather and time. The press kept the story alive, as did the families. But an official named suspect never came. There was no press conference with handcuffs and relieved tears. The case settled into that awful territory between cold and alive. Open, active, waiting. One theory, quietly held by some, louder among others, was that the murders might not have been the work of a single killer. The burial site was a common denominator, yes, but the time frame, the victimology, and Albuquerque's endemic violence against vulnerable women in those years allowed for a second hypothesis. More than one predator exploited the same land for the same reason. The mesa was convenient. The women were invisible to the kind of people who use words like clean up and problem. If multiple men with overlapping habits and hunting grounds used that area, then the stoppage after Montoya's death became less neat. Yet, even within that hypothesis, Montoya's shadow kept falling across the graves. His road, his threats, his last night. Maybe he wasn't the only one. Maybe he was the worst one. Maybe he just happened to die before anyone ever connected his name to that patch of earth. Investigators also followed the route that many modern cases demand. Digital traces, phone records, old burner phones, towers that might have caught a ping at 3:12 a.m. when a car idled with its headlights off. But the window was narrow. The bodies were old. Back then, sex work moved by pager, by payphone, by word of mouth. There were no rideshare receipts, no helpful geolocation histories. The absence of data became its own kind of taunt. Not all of the men whose names bubbled up were monsters on paper. Some were abrasive narcissists. Some were the kind of men who create their own weather systems of suspicion by the way they look at other people, the way they look at women. But when you need proof, a feeling is just fog. Detectives kept their finger on the map, tracing routes over and over, looking for anything they might have missed. Every time a suspect's timeline tangled with the years when women disappeared, they pulled harder. Jobs checked. Alibis tested. Ghost stories sifted from usable facts. The case file grew thicker by inches, not answers. Families didn't let the city forget. They organized memorials on the mesa, bringing flowers and nightlight candles that flickered against the wind. They said the names. They held hands in photographs and insisted on personhood, on lives, beyond the labels of addiction and sex work. One mother pressed a locket into a detective's hand and said, "Please don't let her be only what they wrote about her." It changed how some of the team talked about the case. Not the victims, not the bodies, but Melissa, Victoria, Veronica, Cinnamon, daughters, sisters, people who laughed and fought and sometimes danced when they shouldn't have. The city owes them justice, not just a file number and a press release. In quiet rooms, detectives still run the timeline of 2006, like a film reel. December. The trailer. The teenage girl. The gunshots. And then, nothing on the mesa. If Montoya had survived, if the boyfriend had arrived 10 minutes later, would the ground out there hold more? Or would some new pattern have pushed the graves farther from discovery? No one can answer that without guessing, and guesswork is the enemy of a good case. There are other bright, ugly points on the map. A strip of hotels along Central Avenue where women got into cars because the rent was due and the snow was coming. motels with soft, stained carpets, and a night clerk who learned to look down. A tire shop where someone remembered a regular with a friendly voice and dead eyes. A convenience store on a corner where a woman was seen getting into a dark pickup only weeks before she disappeared. Each of those dots feels like the start of a thread that, if pulled hard enough, could unravel the whole knot. But the threads often snap, and the knot holds. A detective once said that the West Mesa case is shaped like the city itself. Beautiful from a distance, messy up close, made up of too many people who never met, but whose lives brushed against each other in quiet, dangerous ways. There are pieces that make sense alone, but refuse to lock into a single, satisfying picture. At least, not yet. You can believe Montoya did it. You can believe Blia did some of it, or none of it. You can believe in a third name no one has said into a microphone. The truth is, the desert knows exactly what happened, but it won't talk. Years passed. The case did not close. The reward remained. Detectives rotated in and out. New eyes scanned old photos. Technology that didn't exist in 2009 caught up and breathed life into evidence thought too degraded to matter. Families kept showing up with the kind of patience that looks like love and stubbornness welded together. Every anniversary brought new stories, new tips, new people who said, "I always wondered about," and then filled in a blank that wasn't quite the right shape. The work continued. The most haunting thing about the West Mesa isn't only the scale or the cruelty, it's the silence. Somewhere, there is a man who drove alone at night on a road the city has since paved and lit. He left enough distance between the graves to manage timing, to keep his nights from colliding. He understood routine. He trusted the dark. If he's alive, he walks past people who don't know his history every day. He buys coffee. He locks his door. If he's dead, he took the answer with him. And the city is left with a question it may never fully solve. And yet, answers have a way of appearing when people refuse to stop asking. There are tree tags and jewelry boxes and the strange logic of men who think trophies make them strong. There are offhand confessions to cellmates and the way a person tenses when a particular street name is spoken aloud. There are old truck registrations and property survey maps that show who could get onto the mesa without being seen in the years before development crept closer. There are photographs, always photographs, in someone's basement, in a rented storage unit, in a shoebox under a bed that has seen too much heavy sleep. The city changes and changes again, but the fundamentals do not. Someone knows. Someone always knows. If you drive out there at dawn, the mountains are blue and pink at the same time, and the wind tastes like dust. A plaque stands now, names etched into metal that will outlast all of us. People leave flowers. Sometimes they leave cigarettes. They talk to the air and call it prayer. The mesa holds them. The city tells itself it has learned. The police academy teaches new recruits about humility and listening when a person whose life doesn't look like yours tries to get you to understand what danger feels like. The Vice Unit has new protocols. Outreach workers carry Narcan and business cards and their own kind of ferocious hope. If you know something, even now, after all this time, the reward is still there. $100,000 for the piece that fits. The number is public. It has been public for years. But the better reason to talk is the simplest. 11 women and 1 unborn child deserve an ending, not just a beginning written in bones. When you tell this story to an audience, remember to say the names. Remember to insist on their lives. Tell them about the dog walker who found the first bone because she paid attention to an animal who was paying attention to the earth. Tell them about the detectives who stayed late in rooms without windows, and the families who would not stop calling. Tell them about the wind that tried to erase everything, and the way people fought it with photographs, with memory, with stubborn love. And if this story got under your skin, if you felt the city's breath catch when the number of graves ticked up, if you found yourself looking at an empty lot and wondering what it might be hiding, then take that feeling and do something small but human with it. The next time a person on the edge of a city's map asks for help, listen. The next time someone goes missing who doesn't fit the easy, sympathetic headline, say their name anyway. Remember that justice is an action, not a press conference. If you know anything about the West Mesa murders, the Albuquerque Crime Stoppers line is still open. Someone out there holds a detail that could turn a puzzle into a picture. Until then, the desert keeps its own counsel. The names shine in metal, and the wind moves over the ground where a city found what it had been missing for years. The truth, or at least the shape of it, waiting in the dirt. If this story got your heart racing, drop a comment with your theory, hit like, and subscribe so we can keep digging into the cases that refuse to let go.